The contract hit the marble table like a slap. $3 million, 12 months, one signature. Dante Moretti didn't look up from his glass when he slid it across. He just sat there in the half-dark of his private study, shoulders loose, like a man who had already decided how the night would end. The chandelier above threw cold light across the pages, and Alara Voss stood on the other side of that table, reading the numbers twice, because the first time didn't make sense. Her father's debt, her family's name, her 1 year of life, traded like a commodity. "You have until morning," Dante said. His voice was quiet in the way that expensive things are quiet, no wasted energy, no theatrics. Just wait. If you walk out without signing, the debt goes to collection. Your mother loses the house before the week is out. Your father, he paused, tilted his glass slightly. Your father has other problems. Alara's hand was shaking. She pressed it flat against the table so he wouldn't see. It was 2:13 in the morning, and she had just become someone she didn't recognize. Picked up the pen. She signed. If you've ever had to make a decision in the dark that you knew you'd spend the rest of your life second-guessing, if you've ever written your name on something and felt it change you in the same moment, then this story is for you. Stay with me until the very end, because every part of what happens next will shock you. If you're new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the worst year of Alara Voss's life. 3 weeks before she signed that contract, Alara was standing in the parking garage beneath her father's office buildings at 7 in the evening, waiting for a cab that wasn't coming and trying to calculate how bad things actually were. She had the numbers. She'd had them for days. She just kept hoping they'd change. Her father's company, Voss Manufacturing, had been hemorrhaging capital for almost 2 years. She'd seen the quarterly reports. She knew about the withdrawn credit lines, the supplier, the 2 lawsuits that had quietly settled for figures that left almost nothing in reserve. What she hadn't known, what no one had bothered to tell her, was that her father had borrowed against all of it. Every asset, every insurance policy, even the house in Evanston, where her mother had lived for 30 years. She found out the way people always find out about things their families keep from them, by accident. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Ms. Voss. The voice on the other end was male, professional, and completely without warmth. "This is a courtesy call on behalf of Moretti Capital Holdings. Your father's outstanding obligation has been purchased and transferred. We'd like to arrange a meeting." Alara stood very still in the concrete dark of that garage. "What obligation?" A pause. "Not a long one. $3,200,000. Accumulated over 18 months. Your father has been in arrears for 6 of them." She didn't say anything. The number sat in her chest like a stone. "Ms. Voss, we'd like to meet by the end of the week." She hung up without answering. She didn't confront her father that night. She went home instead, sat at her kitchen table with a glass of water she didn't drink, and spent 4 hours going through every document she could access. She was methodical when she was scared. Always had been. It was one of those habits she'd developed young, when things at home were chaotic, and the only thing she could control was information. By midnight, she had confirmed what the caller told her. By 2 in the morning, she understood how bad it was. By 4, she had accepted that she had no legal path to challenge the debt transfer. Paperwork was airtight. Her father had signed everything, every extension, every restructuring. The original creditor had been a private equity firm, and somewhere in the chain of ownership, the debt had landed with Moretti Capital, which was, depending on which sources you believed, either a legitimate investment group or the financial arm of the most powerful organized crime family in Chicago. She knew the name Moretti. Everyone in Chicago knew the name Moretti. She also knew that people who owed the Morettas money didn't just lose their assets. They lost everything else, too, in ways that didn't leave records. She called her father at 4:17 a.m. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been sleeping either. "Dad." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Tell me about the debt." A long silence. Then Alara, "Just tell me." Another silence. When he spoke again, his voice had that particular quality she'd learned to hate. Growing up the voice he used when he'd already made peace with something he knew was wrong. Quiet. Resigned. Like the guilt had been sitting there, so long it had become furniture. Got out of hand, he said. I thought I could fix it. $3 million, Dad. I know what it is. Do you know who has it now? He didn't answer. That was its own answer. The meeting was at a restaurant in River North that looked like a normal steakhouse from the outside. Leather booths, low lighting, good whiskey, the kind of place where men in expensive suits talked about things they wouldn't want recorded. Elara arrived 10 minutes early because she didn't know what else to do with herself, and she sat at the bar with a club soda and told herself she was not frightened. She was absolutely frightened. Dante Moretti arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. Came in through a side entrance with two men she assumed were security, though they looked like they could have been attorneys if you didn't watch their eyes. He was younger than she'd expected. 40, maybe 41. Dark hair, clean-shaved, wearing a jacket that cost more than her monthly rent. He moved through the room like someone who had never once in his adult life felt out of place. He sat down across from her without preamble. Ms. Voss, Mr. Moretti. He looked at her for a moment. Not the way men usually look at women. It wasn't that kind of examination. It was more like he was measuring something internal. Doc, your father isn't here, he said. No. I asked him to be. I know. I asked him not to come. She folded her hands on the table. Whatever you need to say about the debt, you can say to me. Dante studied her. A small something moved across his face, not quite respect, not quite amusement. Something in between. He picked up his water glass. The debt is valid, he said. I won't negotiate the principal. The timeline for repayment is what we're discussing. You purchased it 2 weeks ago. The original creditor had a 12-month restructuring plan in place. She'd done her research. I'd like to continue under those terms. The original creditor isn't involved anymore. I understand that. I'm asking you to honor the structure. I'm not obligated to. No, she agreed. You're not. He set down the glass. Why should I? Because calling in $3 million immediately on a company that's already illiquid doesn't get you $3 million. It gets you a liquidation sale, and a fraction of that in recovered assets. The business has real value if it's given time to stabilize. You know that. You didn't buy this debt because you wanted a fire sale. Something shifted behind his eyes. Then what did I buy it for? Elara held his gaze. I was hoping you'd tell me. He told her 3 days later. He called her directly, not through an assistant, not through a lawyer. His number came up as restricted. She almost didn't pick up. I have a different proposal, he said. What kind of proposal? Kind that erases the debt entirely. She waited. Marry me, he said, 1 year. Legal and documented. At the end of 12 months, the debt is cleared. Your family's business is returned to full operation. Your mother's medical accounts, he paused. Yes, I know about those. They'll be settled. The silence that followed was so complete she could hear her own pulse. That's not a proposal, she said finally. That's a transaction. Yes. Why? That's the one condition, he said. You don't ask why. She was standing in her apartment kitchen in the middle of the afternoon, with sunlight coming through the window, and the world felt suddenly very thin, like a piece of paper someone was about to tear. Pressed her palm flat on the counter. Felt the coldness of the granite. I need 48 hours, she said. You've 24. She spent all 24 of them trying to find a way out that didn't exist. She called 2 attorneys. She called a friend who worked in finance and understood debt transfers better than she did. She sat with her mother for 3 hours on a Tuesday afternoon and didn't say a word about any of it, just held her hand while the television played something. Neither of them watched. Her mother's color was bad. She was thinner than she'd been 6 months ago. The treatment wasn't working well enough, and the better treatment cost money they absolutely did not have. Elara drove home and called Dante Moretti back. I'll sign, she said, but I have conditions of my own. A pause. Tell me. I keep my own apartment through the first month. I'm not moving in immediately. Agreed. I continue working. My job, my schedule, my professional obligations. You don't interfere. Agreed. And if at any point you use this arrangement to harm my family rather than protect them, the agreement is void. A longer pause this time. How would you enforce that? By making sure there are people who know exactly what this arrangement is and how it started. He was quiet for a moment. Then you thought this through. I've been thinking about nothing else for 24 hours. All right, he said. We signed Friday. She told her father Thursday evening. She drove to his apartment, the small one in Wicker Park he'd moved to, after the marital home became technically contested, and she stood in his living room and told him exactly what she'd agreed to. She didn't soften it. He stared at her. He'd aged in the past year in a way that had nothing to do with time. He looked like a man who'd been carrying something so heavy for so long that his body had started to compress under the weight. Elora, don't. Her voice was very controlled. Don't apologize right now. I don't have room for it. You can't marry that man. I already agreed to. Her father stopped, ran a hand across his face. You don't know who he is. I know exactly who he is. She picked up her coat from the chair. That's why I negotiated. She was halfway to the door when he said, quietly, there are things you don't know. About me. About Moretti. She stopped, turned around. He was looking at the floor. His hands were pressed together between his knees, like he was trying to keep them from shaking. What things? She said. He looked up. In his eyes was something she'd never seen there before. Not guilt. Exactly, though there was guilt. It was more like terror. Old, deep, terrible terror. You'll find out, he said. You'll find out, and I need you to know that I'm a dad. She kept her voice level. What did you do? He shook his head, looked away, said nothing. She left. The signing was at Dante's mansion in Lincoln Park. She'd known from various accounts that it was substantial. The reality was still a shock, not because of the size, but because of the atmosphere. Felt occupied, in use, genuinely lived in, which surprised her. She'd expected something that looked more like a stage set. Instead, it felt like a house where someone actually had a life, even if that life was full of things she didn't understand. Contract was 12 pages. She read every word. Dante sat on the other side of the study and read something on his phone and didn't rush her. When she finished, she looked up. The clause on page 7, she said. The one about disclosure restrictions. That's too broad. He looked up from his phone. It bars me from disclosing any information related to Moretti family business operations. She tapped the page. That's unlimited in scope. I'm not signing a blanket non-disclosure that has no defined boundary. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slightly at the attorney standing by the wall. Revise it. Scope it to publicly disclosed information only. The attorney made a note, made the revision, printed a new page. Alara read it, nodded, signed. Dante signed beneath her name without ceremony. He handed the pen to the attorney and said something to him in a low voice that she didn't catch. Then he stood up and said to Alara, I'll have the East Wing prepared. I told you. I know what you told me. I'm not moving up the timeline. He walked past her toward the door. I'm telling you, it'll be ready when you're ready. That's all. He paused at the threshold, looked back. There's dinner at 8 if you want it. You don't have to. He left her standing there with a signed contract and a sensation in her chest she couldn't quite name. She didn't stay for dinner. She drove back to her apartment and sat on her bathroom floor for about 15 minutes, which was something she hadn't done since she was in her 20s, and things had gotten very bad for a different set of reasons. Then she washed her face, made tea, and called her best friend Mara, who picked up immediately, because Mara always picked up. I need to tell you something, Alara said. You sound strange. I did something strange, she told her. All of it. Mara was quiet through the whole thing, which was unusual for Mara, who was the kind of person who had opinions at high velocity about everything. When Alara finished, there was a long pause. Okay, Mara said finally, I need you to hear me. This is the most insane thing I've ever heard in my life. I know, and you're doing it anyway. I already signed. Right. Another pause. So what do you need from me? Alara felt something loosen in her chest. That was Mara. No performance, no prolonged reaction, just the cut to what actually mattered. I need you to know, Alara said. I need someone who knows the whole truth of what this is. Got it. Mara's voice was steady. I know. And you call me if anything feels wrong. I don't care what time it is. Thank you. Don't thank me. I'm furious at you. I'm just also completely on your side. Alara almost laughed. First time in days. It felt strange in her face. She moved into the mansion 3 weeks later. She brought what she needed and left what she didn't, which meant she arrived with 2 suitcases and a box of books, and felt immediately acutely aware of how temporary she was intended to be. The staff was efficient and quiet and did not ask her questions. She was given the East Wing as promised, a sitting room, a bedroom, a private bathroom, all of it clean and well-appointed and utterly impersonal, which she appreciated because it matched exactly how she felt. She didn't see Dante until dinner on the second night. He was already at the table when she came in. He looked up, didn't stand, which she noted without judgment, gestured at the chair across from him. They ate. The food was good. The silence was not uncomfortable, exactly, though it had texture. Then he said, "How's the East Wing?" "Fine," she said. "Thank you. The light's bad in the morning on that side. There's blackout lining in the curtains," I noticed. More quiet. He poured himself more water. She watched him and tried to figure out what she was dealing with, what kind of person lived behind that composed, deliberate surface. "You're watching me," he said. Not accusatory. Just a statement. "You're watching me too," she said. He looked up from his plate. Something moved in his expression, brief and then gone. "Fair," he said. She discovered the locked room on her 6th night in the mansion. She hadn't been snooping. She'd been looking for the linen closet because one of the towels in her bathroom had a small tear, and she'd wanted to swap it herself rather than bother the staff at 10:30 at night. The hallway was familiar enough by then that she moved through it without turning on overhead lights, just using the ambient glow from the garden lamps outside the windows. The door was at the end of the hall that branched left, past the second library. She'd walked past it before, without really registering it. Now she noticed it because of the light. There was a thin line of light visible at the bottom. Stopped. She stood in the corridor for probably 30 seconds, long enough to talk herself out of it twice, and then dismiss both arguments. Then she walked to the door and turned the handle. Locked, of course. But the light was there, thin yellow, and through the door not voices, but the particular silence of a room that's occupied. Kind of quiet that isn't empty. She stood there another moment. Then she walked back to her room. She did not sleep for a long time. She found out what was inside by accident again, because that seemed to be how she encountered every piece of this story. A housekeeper left a key on the hallway table. Wrong table. Intended for a different room. Alara saw it the next morning when she was going down for coffee and recognized by its shape that it wasn't a standard door key. Something smaller, older. She picked it up, set it back down, picked it up again. She stood outside the locked door for 4 minutes before she used it. The room was large. Not a closet, not a storage space. It had been organized with the kind of deliberate care that meant someone came in here regularly and could tell immediately if anything was out of place. 3 walls were covered in photographs not hung for display, but pinned carefully, overlapping in some places, with dates written in black marker in the bottom corners. Strings connected some of them. Notes in 2 different handwriting styles were attached to others. It took her 15 seconds to realize what she was looking at. Her family, her father, her mother herself at various ages, the house in Evanston, the old manufacturing plant, her father at business meetings she didn't recognize, with people she'd never seen, images pulled from what looked like surveillance footage and security camera stills, images that were clearly professional photographs taken with a telephoto lens. 20 years of photographs. She moved along the wall slowly, trying to process what she was seeing. Her father at 30, at 40. Herself at 10 years old, standing in front of a school she recognized. Herself at 17 getting into a car. Her mother at a hospital appointment. Then the newest photographs. Recent. Within the last month, she recognized her own coat. On one of them, someone had written in red marker across the white border at the bottom. A date and 4 words. Still doesn't know. Alara stood in that room and looked at those 4 words for a long time. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She moved fast, turned off the light, stepped behind the door, pressed herself flat against the wall. Footsteps paused outside. She could see the shadow of feet in the thin line at the base of the door. 1 second, 2 seconds. Then the footsteps moved on. She stood in the dark room alone, breathing very carefully through her nose, and understood for the first time, with absolute certainty, that she had signed a contract without knowing what it actually was. and that somewhere in this house, someone had been building a case against her family for 20 years. Question the one that was going to change everything wasn't what her father had done. It was why Dante Moretti had waited this long to do something about it. She stood in the dark for another full minute before she moved. Key was still in her hand. She could feel the edge of it pressing into her palm, a small specific pain she was grateful for, because it gave her something to focus on that wasn't the photographs. She unlocked the door from the inside, eased it open 2 inches, listened. Nothing in the hall. She slipped out, pulled the door shut behind her, heard the latch click back into place, and walked to the end of the corridor at a pace that was slightly too fast to be casual and slightly too controlled to be panic. Back in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and looked at her own hands. They were not shaking. She found that strange. She should have been shaking. She had just walked into a room that contained 20 years of surveillance on her family, pinned to a wall inside the home of a man she had legally married 6 days ago. She should have been falling apart. Instead, she felt something very cold and very clear, moving through her, the way river water feels when you put your hand beneath the surface in October, not numbness, the opposite of numbness, every nerve firing at once. She lay back on the bed without taking off her shoes and stared at the ceiling and began systematically to revise everything she thought she knew. She was at the breakfast table at 7 the next morning, early enough that she knew the household wouldn't expect her. She'd made a deliberate calculation. Normal schedule was a kind of cover. Disrupting it even slightly would register with someone. She didn't know yet who in this house reported to whom, but she knew that someone did, because that's how houses like this worked. Dante came in at 7:40. He stopped when he saw her, not with surprise exactly, but with the particular quality of attention that someone gives to an unexpected variable. He poured his coffee, sat down at the opposite end of the table, opened the newspaper, actual print, which she found faintly jarring, given everything else about him. "You're up early," he said, not looking up from the paper. "Couldn't sleep." She watched him read, watched the way he turned the pages deliberate, unhurried, the way he held the cup. Nothing performative about it. He wasn't putting on a show of calm. He just actually was calm, which she was beginning to understand was more unsettling than any amount of visible menace. "I got lost last night," she said, looking for the linen closet. He turned a page. "East end of the hall past the second bathroom. Left side, I went right. Common mistake. I'll have someone mark it." He said it without any change in tone or posture, without a flicker. She watched his hands, his shoulders, the back of his neck, when he tilted the page slightly toward the light. Nothing. Either he didn't know she'd found the room, or he was very, very good. She suspected it was the latter. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "The direction." He looked up then, briefly, and met her eyes across the length of the table. Something passed between them, quick and indeterminate, like the shadow of a bird going over. "Of course," he said, and went back to the paper. She called Mara from her car in the parking structure at work. "I need you to look something up for me," she said. "Don't use your work computer. Use your personal one, from home, and clear your history after." A pause. "Ilara, I know. That's not a normal favor you're asking me for. I know that too." She pressed her forehead briefly against the steering wheel. "Dante Moretti had a brother. I need to know how he died." Silence on the other end. "Please," Ilara said. "Give me tonight," Mara said. Work was its own kind of refuge. She was the head of procurement for a mid-sized logistics firm, and the work was demanding, in exactly the way she needed it to be right now: concrete, transactional, requiring her full attention for long enough stretches that the photographs on the wall and the locked room and her father's terrified face at 4A. M had to wait outside the door, like things that knew they weren't welcome here. She had 3 meetings. She reviewed 2 contracts. She ate a sandwich at her desk and didn't taste it. At 4 in the afternoon, her assistant knocked and said there was a man downstairs asking for her. "Does he have a name?" "He said to tell you it was about a family matter. He said you'd know what that means." She went downstairs. It wasn't Dante. It was one of the 2 men who'd come in with him at the restaurant, the one who had stood to his right. He was waiting in the lobby in a charcoal suit that was cut well enough to obscure the shoulder holster underneath it, though not quite well enough to fool her. "Ms. Voss." He handed her an envelope. Mr. Moretti asked that you received this personally. She took it. What is it? He said you'd know when you opened it. A pause. He also said to tell you, and these are his words, that the East Wing linen closet key has been returned to its proper hook. Kept her face completely still. Thank you, she said. She went back upstairs, locked her office door, sat down, and opened the envelope. Inside was a single index card, written, in a clean, spare hand, I know you went in. I'm not angry, but we should talk before you talk to anyone else. She read it 3 times. Then she took a lighter from her desk drawer. She kept one for the candle she occasionally burned when the office felt claustrophobic, and she burned the card in her ceramic coffee saucer and watched it go to ash. She thought he knew immediately. Then she thought he left the key there on purpose. She found him in the back garden when she got home that evening. He was sitting in one of the stone chairs near the far wall with a glass of something, and no phone, no paper, just sitting with the particular stillness of someone thinking hard. He looked up when he heard her heels on the flagstones. She sat in the chair across from him. Didn't wait for an invitation because she was done waiting for invitations. You left the key there, she said. Yes. You wanted me to find the room. He considered that. I wanted to know if you would. And now you know. Now I know. She looked at him. The light was going, the last of it catching the edge of the garden wall. And in that half-light, he looked different than he did indoors, younger, or maybe just less armored. She didn't let that register as anything important. The photographs go back 20 years, she said. 22. You've been building something. A case. Research. I don't know what to call it. All 3, he said. Against my father. He didn't answer that directly. He turned the glass slightly in his hand, watching the light move through it. Against a set of events that involved your father. There's a difference. Not from where I'm sitting. No, he said. I don't suppose there is. She leaned forward slightly. I agreed not to ask why you chose me. That was the condition I signed. But I didn't agree not to ask what that room is. He looked at her for a moment. No, he said slowly. You didn't. Set the glass down on the arm of the chair. What do you want to know? Everything. That's going to take longer than one evening. Then start with the part that matters most. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. Not evasive, she could tell the difference. He was deciding where to cut in, the way a surgeon decides where the incision needs to go. She waited him out. My brother's name was Marco, he said. He was killed 11 years ago. It was staged to look like a rival operation. Everyone believed it for a long time. He paused. I didn't. Why not? Because I knew my brother, and I knew the rivals we had at that time. The mechanics were wrong. The timing was wrong. He picked up his glass again. Took me 4 years to find the thread. Another 3 to follow it far enough to know where it went. His eyes came to hers. It went to your father. The word landed without drama. He'd said it evenly, without heat, which somehow made it worse. My father didn't kill anyone, she said. Her voice was flat because she was keeping it flat through effort. Not directly. What does that mean? It means he was one part of something larger. He didn't pull the trigger. But without what he did, what he agreed to, what he allowed, the trigger would never have been pulled. Dante's jaw tightened, barely visible, and then released. He knew what the money was for, Elara. Project Blackwell wasn't a legitimate operation. He knew what he was financing. She sat with that. Her hands were in her lap. She pressed them flat against her thighs. You're telling me this now, she said carefully. Why? Because you went into the room, and because you're not the kind of person who stops at what she finds. You'll keep pulling at this, and I'd rather you pull at it with me than around me. She stared at him. That's a very rational way to describe involving your wife in the investigation of her own family. Something brief moved across his face, not quite humor, not quite pain. I told you, I'm not angry that you went in. You should be. Maybe. He reached down and picked up his glass again. Are you angry at me? She considered the question honestly, because it deserved honesty. I don't know yet, she said. I will be once I've processed all of this properly. Right now I'm just... She stopped, searched for the right word. Recalibrating. That's fair. It's not fair, she said. None of this is fair. I just don't have time to be unfair about it. Mara called at 9:30 that night. Marco Moretti, she said without preamble. 34 years old when he died. Official cause of death shooting, ruled a gang-related homicide. Case went cold 18 months later. A pause. But here's what's interesting. 2 weeks before he died, he filed a motion with the Illinois State Attorney's Office. Can't find the content, it's sealed, but the filing exists. Found the reference in a court record database. Alara was standing at her window, looking out at the garden. The stone chairs were empty now. One more thing, Mara said. The law firm that represented the Moretti family in the aftermath their estate handling, the wrongful civil case, that never went anywhere. That firm also did work for Voss Manufacturing about 12 years ago. Found it in their public client list. Alara closed her eyes. Same firm, which could mean nothing. It's a big city, and it's not a small firm. Mara's voice dropped slightly. Or it could mean somebody was very careful about keeping certain things inside a certain circle. Thank you, Alara said. Alara, please be careful. I am. I don't mean careful like watch your step. I mean careful like I need you to still exist in 6 months. I know what you meant. The gala was Dante's idea. Or rather, it was an obligation, a charity event his organization had sponsored for the past 7 years. The kind of thing that served multiple purposes in the world he occupied. Legitimate profile, useful contacts, performance of normal civic life layered over everything else. He told Alara about it 4 days in advance, told her attendance was optional, but that her presence would be noted either way. She went. The venue was a converted hall near the lakefront. 200 people at least. Wait staff moving through with champagne. A string quartet doing something melancholy in the corner. A lot of people dressed carefully and watching each other, with the specific alertness of people who understood that who you talked to and for how long was a kind of language. Dante moved through the room with practiced ease, and Alara moved beside him. She was good at this. She'd been doing corporate events for years, and the fundamental social mechanics weren't that different. You watched people's eyes, not their mouths. You listened to what they didn't say. You remembered names. She noticed the man near the East Bar at 40 minutes in. He was watching Dante. Not openly he was good, but she'd been watching the room, too, and there was a quality to his attention that was different from normal social surveillance. Tracking. Calculating. His drink hadn't gone down in 20 minutes. She leaned toward Dante slightly. East Bar, gray jacket. Don't look immediately. He didn't. He finished his sentence to the man he was talking to, laughed briefly at something, then turned to accept a glass from a passing waiter, using the movement to scan the room naturally. I see him, he said, quiet enough that only she could hear. Do you know him? No. He's been watching you since we moved to this side of the room. Dante's hand moved almost imperceptibly, a small gesture at his left side, which she realized was a signal to someone she couldn't identify. Then he turned back to the conversation, as if nothing had shifted. 20 seconds later, the man at the East Bar was approached by one of the security staff. A casual convergence. 2 men near a bar, nothing visible to the room. Alara watched. The man's posture changed the moment the security contact got close. A small hardening, an adjustment. He said something. Security man nodded, said something back. Then the man in the gray jacket set down his drink and walked toward the exit. Not quickly. Measured. Like someone who'd made a decision. Dante touched her elbow. Stay close to me for the rest of the evening. What was that? I don't know yet. But you think it was something. I think someone sent him to look at something, or confirm something, and I think we should finish the next hour quickly and leave. She nodded. She did not look toward the exit again. Picked up her champagne and turned back to the room and smiled at the woman, approaching them, and said something pleasant and entirely meaningless about the string quartet. The bullet came through the east-facing window 45 minutes later. She felt it more than heard it, a concussion of sound, and then Dante's hand was on her shoulder, and she was moving sideways and down behind the heavy oak pillar at the edge of the small stage, her champagne gone somewhere, her heart a sudden roar behind her sternum. Around them, the room erupted screaming, the crash of overturned tables, the scrambling of 200 people, discovering that they were not, in this moment, safe. She was on her knees behind the pillar. Dante was crouched beside her, his hand on her back, and there was blood on his jacket sleeve. Not a little blood. You're hit, she said. His face was very composed. Pale, slightly, but composed. Can you move? Yes. Then we move now. Stay low and stay behind me. She did both. They moved through the chaos toward the service corridor, at the back of the hall. Dante knew exactly where it was, had probably mapped it before they arrived, and she filed that away without comment because it was not the moment for commentary. Two of his security were already in the corridor when they got there, and they moved fast, out through the kitchen, out through a loading dock, into a waiting car that had already been brought around. Inside the car, moving, Dante took off his jacket and pressed it against his upper arm. The wound was real, not grazed. That had been, for her benefit, the bleeding was too steady for grazed. She took the jacket from his hand and held it herself, pressing firmly, and he let her, without argument, which told her something about how much he was actually managing. The man at the bar, she said. Yes, he was a spotter. Most likely. For Silas Kane? He looked at her. She'd done her research. She'd looked up Dante's rivals. In the days after finding the room, had assembled as much as she could from public sources and legal records, and the negative spaces in business filings where things that should be visible weren't. Kane is the obvious answer, he said carefully. You sound like you don't think it's the obvious answer. His jaw moved. He looked out the window at the city going past in the dark, lit and fast, and completely indifferent to what had just happened. The shooter knew where I'd be standing, he said. The trajectory was off for Kane's usual people. They shoot wide, compensate. This was precise. He paused. Someone told them exactly where to aim. She understood what he was saying. Someone inside. Yes. The car moved. The city moved. Pressed the jacket against his arm and kept her breathing steady in thought. About 22 years of photographs pinned to a wall and a sealed court filing, and a law firm that had represented both families simultaneously and her father's face. 4 in the morning saying, there are things you don't know. Dante. Her voice was quiet. The sniper. If the shot was aimed precisely where you were standing. She paused.
You weren't the target.
He turned to look at her. I was, she said. I was standing 2 feet to your left. If you hadn't moved when you did. She stopped. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his expression she saw something she had seen them seen for before. Not alarm. He was past alarm. Something older and more complicated. Something that looked, if she was reading it right, like guilt. I know, he said quietly. You knew before it happened. I suspected. She stared at him. The car moved. Her hands were steady against his arm, and she was very glad they were steady, because the rest of her was not. Who wants me dead? She said. He was quiet for 3 seconds that felt much longer. That, he said, is what I've been trying to find out for 3 weeks. She pulled back slightly and looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't let herself look before, past the composure and the calculation. He was in pain. The arm was worse than he'd let on, and underneath the control, something was grinding that she didn't have a name for yet. When were you going to tell me? She said. He didn't answer. Dante, when were you going to tell me someone might try to kill me? When I knew enough to tell you something useful, he said. Telling you sooner would have been... Don't. Her voice came out sharp and low. Don't tell me it was for my protection. I have signed a contract that put me inside your world. I had a right to know there was a target on me before I walked into a room of 200 people. He held her gaze. He didn't flinch from it. You're right, he said. The simplicity of it took some of the heat out of her. She pressed the jacket against his arm again. We're going to fix that arm when we get back, she said. I have someone. I know you have someone. I'm telling you it happens as soon as we get through the door. A pause. All right. And then you're going to tell me everything. Not the version you've decided is appropriate. Everything. He looked at her for a moment in the moving dark. Everything, he said. He told her about Marco first. Not the overview, she'd already heard the details. The way Marco had been, quiet and sharp, and better with people than Dante had ever been. The way Marco had come to him 3 weeks before he died and said, there's something wrong inside the organization. I've been building a file. I think it goes all the way up, and I need you to trust me on this. The way Dante had told him to slow down. Be careful. They'd talk after the weekend. The way Marco had been dead before the weekend. They were sitting in the study. Someone had tended the arm she'd insisted, and Dante had submitted to it with the resigned patience of a man who understood when it was not worth arguing. He had a bandage now, visible below the rolled sleeve, and a glass of water he wasn't drinking. I spent 3 years thinking it was a rival faction, he said. That was what the evidence said. That's what the investigation, such as it was, concluded. I rebuilt the organization. I took apart the rivals piece by piece. His voice was very even. And then one day, someone left a drive on the seat of my car. No note, just files. What kind of files? Project Blackwell. Counting records, communication logs, internal memos, written in a cipher that took me 8 months to crack. He looked at his water glass. Marco had been building the same file from the inside. He'd gotten further than I thought. Someone must have held it after he died and eventually decided it needed to see light. Who left the drive? I've never been able to confirm it. A pause. I have a theory. I don't have evidence. She waited. He didn't continue on that thread. The accounting records showed the money, she said. My father's company. Yes. And Project Blackwell. Yes, she exhaled slowly. What was Project Blackwell? He looked at her directly. A coordinated operation to eliminate 2 members of the Moretti family and restructure control of the organization. Marco was one. I was the other. He paused. They only succeeded with one. She sat with that. The room was very quiet. Outside the window, the garden was dark. My father didn't know that's what it was, she said. It wasn't quite a question. I don't know what your father knew, Dante said. That's the part I can't prove yet. I know he moved the money. I know it funded the operation. Whether he understood the full scope. He stopped. That's what I've been trying to determine for the last 4 years. She looked at him. That's why you married me. He didn't look away. Yes, to get close enough to find out. That was the original intent, he said. And then, very carefully, things are more complicated now. She didn't ask him what that meant. She wasn't ready for that answer, and he seemed to understand that because he didn't try to give it. What she said instead was, someone inside your organization tried to have me killed tonight, using information that could only have come from inside. Yes. Which means whoever it is knows the real purpose of this marriage. Yes. And they're afraid of what I might find out. She met his eyes. Or what you might find out through me. He was very still. There's something else, she said. She could feel it, the thing he hadn't said, sitting between them like a closed door. Something you still haven't told me. He looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she thought he wasn't going to say it. Your father, he said at last. His voice was careful, in the way that things are careful when they carry weight. I told you he had other problems. The night we first met, when I was explaining the debt. I remember. I said that because I'd received information that week, from a source I trust. His hands were flat on the table, very still. Alara, your father isn't in hiding. He isn't a victim of the people who ran Project Blackwell. He looked at her, and his eyes were not unkind, but they were absolutely unsparing. Your father has been in contact with Silas Kane for the past 2 months. The room held the silence. He's not the man they destroyed, Dante said quietly. He's still inside this. She didn't move. That was the first thing, the absolute absence of motion. Every other time in her life, when she'd received devastating information, she'd had some physical response. A flinch, a step back, the body doing what the mind couldn't process yet. This time, nothing. She sat across from Dante in the quiet study with the garden dark outside, and the bandage white on his arm and the words in contact with Silas Kane hanging in the air between them like smoke, and she did not move a single muscle. Then she said, "Show me." He opened the drawer to his right and produced a folder. He slid it across the table without ceremony, the way he'd slid the contract across on the night they met, and she registered the symmetry of that without comment. She opened it. Surveillance photographs. Her father outside a building she didn't recognize, brick facade, no visible signage, industrial neighborhood, somewhere on the south side. Her father getting into a black car she'd never seen. Her father at a window table in a restaurant, across from a man whose face was partially obscured, but whose build, and the particular way he held himself, she filed for later. Timestamps on every image. 8 separate encounters over a span of 62 days. She turned the last photograph over, set it face down, closed the folder. "How long have you had these?" she said. "First 3 came in 5 weeks ago. The rest accumulated since. Before the gala." "Yes." She looked at him. "You took me to that gala, knowing my father was feeding information to your enemy. I took you to that gala, not yet knowing the full picture of what your father was providing." He held her gaze. There's a difference. Is there? Her voice was still controlled, but the edge in it was real, and she wasn't trying to hide it. What do you think he's giving Kane? What could my father possibly have that Kane wants? Information about this marriage, Dante said. About why it happened. About what I've been building. A pause. About you. She let that settle. Her father, feeding details about her life, her location, her schedule, her relationship with Dante to a man who had just sent a sniper to a room where she was standing. She thought about the gala, the shooter's precision, the trajectory Dante had described as wrong for Kane's usual people, too accurate, too specific, too informed. He told them where I'd be standing, she said. Not a question. Dante was quiet. He told them exactly where I'd be standing, she said again, and her voice this time was different, lower, stripped of the control she'd been maintaining for the last hour. My father told Silas Kane where to aim. I don't know that with certainty. Yes, you do. She looked at him directly. You knew before tonight. That's what you've been trying to determine. You said it yourself whether he understood the full scope. That was the question, and the gala answered it. He didn't deny it. He stood up. She didn't know she was going to until she was already doing it. She walked to the window and put one hand flat against the glass and looked out at the dark garden and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The glass was cold under her palm. She focused on that. Behind her, she heard Dante not moving. He understood. She was beginning to realize when presence was enough, and when any attempt at language would be the wrong thing. She stood at the window for 3 minutes. Then she turned around. What do we do? She said. That depends, he said carefully, on what you want to protect. Everything I thought I was protecting is already compromised. Her voice was flat and steady. My family's safety, my mother's treatment, the business. All of it is already inside this, which means the only thing that protects any of it now is understanding exactly how deep this goes. She came back to the table, sat down. So tell me about Project Blackwell. Everything you cracked from those files. Every name. He looked at her for a moment. Then he opened the drawer again. Took until 2 in the morning. She didn't take notes. She had the feeling that written notes in this house were not a safe practice. So listened with the kind of concentrated attention she'd trained in herself over years of contract negotiation, capacity to hold complex information in structure without the anchor of paper. Dante spoke carefully and in sequence, which she appreciated. He had a methodical mind. Whatever else he was, he thought in systems. Project Blackwell had originated 14 years ago. It was not, at its root, a plan to kill anyone. It had started as an internal restructuring scheme, a plan by a faction within the Moretti organization to shift the balance of power before the current leadership consolidated it further. 2 men had driven it in the early stages. One was dead. The other Dante had not yet named. Her father's role had been financial architecture, moving money through Voss Manufacturing's accounts in a pattern that obscured the source and made the capital appear to originate from legitimate business income. Layering. He'd been good at it. She had to concede that, though the thought made her stomach turn. He'd been good at it because he understood how auditors thought, what they looked for, what they ignored. He told himself it was consulting work, Dante said. That's my read. He told himself it was financial management for a private investment group, and that what the money eventually funded wasn't his responsibility. His jaw moved. Whether he maintained that fiction once the operation escalated into something lethal. That's the question I can't answer yet. Doesn't matter, she said. He looked at her. It matters to me personally, she said, but it doesn't change the legal or practical reality. He moved the money. He has been in active contact with Silas Kane. He was present in some form. When someone tried to kill me tonight, she pressed her hands together on the table. Whatever his interior justifications are, the situation is what it is. Studied her face. You're processing this very cleanly for what it is. I'm not processing it at all, she said. I'm compartmentalizing it until I have the space to fall apart properly. Those are different things. A beat. Then quietly, when do you think you'll have that space? She almost laughed. It came out wrong. Halfway between a laugh and something raw. Maybe when this is over. She looked down at her hands. Ever over. She went to see her father the next morning. She didn't tell Dante she was going. She didn't ask permission. That wasn't the arrangement she was operating under. But she also didn't mention it, because she knew if she did, he would want to send someone with her, and she needed to be in the room alone. She dressed at 6:30, left the mansion before the household was fully active, and drove to Wicker Park in the pale, early light with the radio off, and nothing in her head but a white, sustained focus. He answered the door in yesterday's clothes. He looked like he hadn't slept. His face when he saw her shifted through several things in rapid sequence: relief, guilt, something else she couldn't name, and then settled into a kind of exhausted resignation. "I know why you're here," he said. "Let me in, Dad." Step back. The apartment was the way it always was, underfurnished. Too many papers. The particular disorder of a man whose interior life had outgrown his ability to manage the exterior one. She didn't sit down. She stood in the middle of the living room and looked at him. "Tell me about Silas Kane," she said. He sat heavily on the couch, pressed both hands over his face, made a sound she'd never heard from him before, not crying, something compressed and more fundamental than that. "Dad." She kept her voice even. "I was in that room last night when the shot came through the window. Someone told the shooter exactly where I'd be standing." She paused. "Tell me it wasn't you." He lowered his hands. His eyes were red-rimmed. "Tell me it wasn't you." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. Counted them. They were the longest 3 seconds of her life, and when they ended without him speaking, something in her chest caved in and then hardened immediately over the wound, the way tissue does when it has no other choice. "What did they tell you?" he said finally. "What did you find out?" "That you've met with Kane 8 times in 2 months. That you have been inside Project Blackwell since the beginning. The money you moved through Voss Manufacturing funded an operation that killed Marco Moretti and was supposed to kill Dante." She stopped. Her voice had gotten very quiet. "And that I was apparently a loose end that someone decided to deal with at a charity gala." He was shaking. She could see it, his hands, his jaw. The shaking of a man who had been holding something enormous for a very long time and had finally reached the limit. "I didn't know about the gala," he said. "I didn't know they were going to—" He stopped. "Kane told me it was just surveillance, that they needed to know if Moretti had found the files. Seen the room." "You told him I'd seen the room." He closed his eyes. "You told Silas Kane that I had access to evidence that could expose Project Blackwell," she said, and her voice now was barely above a whisper because anything louder would not have stayed under control. "And then someone sent a shooter to a room where your daughter was standing. I didn't know they'd—" "Stop." The word came out like something cut. "Stop telling me what you didn't know. Tell me what you did know. Tell me what you've known all along." He opened his eyes. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen on his face in 40 years, not shame. She'd seen shame on him before. This was older than shame. This was the face of someone who had made a decision so long ago that they'd almost convinced themselves it hadn't been a decision at all. And now the bill had arrived in the form of their own child standing in front of them, demanding an accounting. He told her. It took 40 minutes. Marco Moretti had come to her father 12 years ago, not as an adversary, as an ally. Marco had found evidence of the internal conspiracy and had been trying to build a coalition of people who could expose it from within without triggering a violent response. He'd believed her father was clean. He'd shared what he had. Her father had taken the information and sat on it for 3 weeks while he decided what to do. In those 3 weeks, the faction running Project Blackwell had approached him with a different offer. They knew Marco had made contact. They wanted to know what Marco had shown him. In exchange for that information, they offered to clear the company's mounting debt and guarantee the safety of his family. He had taken the offer. "I told myself Marco would be warned off," he said. His voice was barely holding together. "That if I gave them enough to satisfy them, they'd back away from him. That nobody would get hurt." "Marco was dead within a month," Alara said. "I know. You gave them what they needed to kill him. I didn't know they would, Dad." She was looking at him without blinking. "You knew what these people were. You knew what the organization was. You knew what it meant to give an enemy the location and intelligence of someone who was building a case against them." Her voice shook finally, just slightly. "You knew." He didn't answer. He'd run out of answers. He just sat there with his hands between his knees and looked at her with those ruined eyes and offered nothing because there was nothing adequate to offer. Stood up. She needed to move. She walked to the window. The same instinct as last night, find the glass. Find the cold. Find something external to press against. Kane, she said without turning around. What does he want from you now? He wants the files. Her father's voice was dull. Whatever Dante has compiled. The Blackwell records. The financial evidence. He wants to know how close Moretti is to having enough to go to federal investigators. And what have you told him? A pause. That I don't know. That you haven't told me anything. He hesitated. That's the truth, Alara. I haven't given him anything about you, specifically since the gala. When I found out what they'd done, he stopped. I went quiet. Stopped returning calls. She turned around. For how long? 5 days. Kane will send someone to re-establish contact. I know. When he does, she said slowly. You're going to answer. He looked up at her. Something shifted in his face alarm, or maybe the beginning of understanding. You're going to answer, she said, and you're going to tell me everything he says. She was back at the mansion by noon. Dante was in the main room with a man she hadn't seen before, 50s, compact build, the watchful stillness of someone who spent a lot of time being professionally invisible. He looked up when she walked in. Dante looked up a half-second after him, which told her the other man had faster instincts, which told her something about what he did. Alara. Dante's voice was neutral. This is Carr. He runs my security analysis. The shooter from last night, she said. Have you identified him? Carr glanced at Dante. Dante nodded slightly. We have a partial on the rifle, Carr said. His voice was dry and flat, a man who dealt in facts, the way other people dealt in pleasantries. Eastern European manufacture. Modified. The position was a maintenance access point. On the building across the street, someone had the code. That code was generated internally. From this household security system, the room was very quiet. Someone in this house gave them the access code, Alara said. Yes. She looked at Dante. We're working on it, he said. His jaw was tight. How many people in this household have access to that system? 14, Carr said. We're running elimination now, while whoever it is still inside these walls. We have containment protocols. I'm not criticizing the protocol, she said. I'm establishing the situation. The person who tried to have me killed may be in this building right now. She said it evenly, because the evenness was necessary, because if she let the actual weight of that land fully, she would stop functioning, and she could not afford to stop functioning. What do we need from me? Carr looked at her with the particular assessment of someone recalibrating an earlier assumption. Your movements for the last 2 weeks, every deviation from your stated schedule, any conversations you had in this house that you wouldn't have had in front of Mr. Moretti. She walked to the chair and sat down. All right, she said. Let's start. She was 3 days into the internal investigation, 3 days of controlled, deliberate normalcy over a household that had turned into something else entirely. Everyone watched and watching. The air in every room carrying the specific charge of mutual suspicion. When Mara called with something that broke the framework of everything, Alara thought she understood. She stepped outside to take the call. Garden. Stone chairs. Late afternoon, cold and gray. The kind of Chicago autumn light that feels like the city is conserving itself for something harder ahead. I found the sealed filing, Mara said. Marco Moretti's motion to the state attorney, 12 years ago. Ilara's hand tightened on the phone. How? Don't ask me how. Point is, I have it. She heard Mara's breathing, slightly uneven in a way that was not like Mara. Ilara. Marco wasn't filing an expose on the organization. He was filing for protective custody, for a civilian. She went very still. There was a child, Mara said, a little girl, 8 years old. Marco had been informally protecting her for about a year. The filing describes her as the daughter of a person of interest in an ongoing internal matter, at risk of being used as leverage. Mara's voice dropped. Filing has her listed by first name only. The last name is redacted. What's the first name? Alara said. Her own voice sounded very far away. A pause, Alara, Mara said. The garden was silent. A bird moved somewhere in the hedge. The gray light pressed down on everything. The little girl in the filing, Mara said carefully. Her name is Alara. She was 8 years old when Marco filed it. She was the daughter of a person connected to Project Blackwell. Another pause, and Marco Moretti died 1 month after submitting it. sat down in the stone chair because her legs had made a decision without consulting her. He wasn't just protecting a source, Alara said. Her voice was barely there. He was protecting me. That's what it looks like. She thought about the photograph. The one Dante had mentioned in the outline she'd constructed from his fragments, a photograph of a child standing beside Marco Moretti. Thought about Dante saying she doesn't remember him. She'd assumed that was a figure of speech. A general statement about time and memory. She thought about being 8 years old, about a year that was blurry in her recollection, a year when her father had been agitated and absent, and her mother had been quietly frightened in a way she'd never explained. A year when there had been, she now remembered, a man who sometimes picked her up from school. Quiet, patient, good at making her laugh. She'd thought he was a family friend. She had not thought of him in 30 years. Mara, she said. Yeah. Dante doesn't know. Are you sure? She thought about it. Really thought. Every conversation, every careful revelation, the files in the room, the photographs. He knows I was in the photograph. He doesn't know why Marco was protecting me. He doesn't know his brother knew what my father was involved in and chose to protect me anyway, rather than use me as leverage against my father. That changes things. It changes everything. She pressed her free hand against her knee to stop the trembling that had started there. Marco Moretti spent the last year of his life making sure I was safe. My father was the person whose decisions put me at risk in the first place. She stopped. And someone killed Marco before he could get me into protective custody. Alara, the person who killed Marco, killed the only person who was actively trying to protect me. She stood up. Her legs were steadier now, the shock having passed through and left behind it something harder and colder and far more useful. And the person who gave the order, who provided the intelligence that made it possible, was my father. The words were out before she'd fully thought them through, but they were true. And she knew they were true, and the knowing of them settled into her bones like something permanent. What are you going to do? Mara asked. I'm going to tell Dante. Is that safe? She thought about the bandage on his arm. He'd sat in the car and let her hold pressure against the wound without argument. The way he'd said everything when she'd demanded it and then actually delivered. The way he'd looked at her in the garden and said, things are more complicated now, and hadn't tried to explain what he meant because he'd understood she wasn't ready. I don't know, she said honestly, but it's the right thing to do. She hung up. She stood in the cold garden and looked at the stone wall at the far end and breathed. The truth was assembling itself in her mind into a shape she could now see whole, and the shape was terrible and clarifying in equal measure. Marco Moretti had died protecting her. Her father had made that death possible, and Dante had spent 11 years trying to find the truth of his brother's murder while the answer had been living inside a marriage contract he'd written himself. Standing at his breakfast table reading his newspaper, sleeping 20 feet down a corridor from the locked room where every piece of it was pinned to a wall. She had walked into this house thinking she was a woman paying a debt. She understood now that she had been, from the very beginning, at the center of this. She went inside to find Dante. She moved through the corridor quickly, past the second library, past the east wing entrance, toward the study. She pushed the door open without knocking because she had lost patience with protocol. He was there, and he was not alone. Victor Moretti stood by the window. Dante's uncle, sickly, silver-haired, with the distinguished bearing of a man who had spent decades being the most trusted person in a room. He'd come to the wedding ceremony. She'd met him briefly, a handshake and a measured smile. She'd registered him as someone important and moved on. He turned when she entered. His expression was pleasant. It was the pleasantness of a man who was very good at pleasant. Mrs. Moretti, he said warmly. I was just leaving. He crossed the room. He paused beside her at the door, and very quietly, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it, he said in a voice that only she could hear, you should stop asking questions about Marco. He said it the way someone says it might rain later, gentle, advisory, almost kind. Then he left. She stood in the doorway and looked at Dante across the room, and understood three things simultaneously. Victor knew what she'd found. Victor was warning her, and Victor was the second man, the unnamed one, who had driven Project Blackwell from the beginning. The person she needed to expose was standing inside this house every time Dante trusted him. and Dante had no idea. She closed the door, not hard. She didn't slam it, because slamming it told Victor something she wasn't ready for him to know. She closed it with deliberate quietness, the click of the latch the only sound. And then she stood inside the study with her back against the door and looked at Dante across the room. He was watching her face. He'd been watching it since she walked in, reading whatever was visible there. And she knew from the stillness that had come over him that he was reading something significant. "What did he say to you?" Dante asked. "He told me to stop asking questions about Marco." The room went very still. She watched Dante's expression move through several things: confusion first, then recalibration, then something that wasn't quite anger, but was the substrate beneath anger, the cold tectonic thing that anger grows from. Stood up from his chair, slowly. He moved to the center of the room. He stood there with his hands at his sides, and she could see the muscle along his jaw working. "Say that again," he said. He stopped beside me at the door. He said it quietly. "Just the two of us." She kept her voice level. "Dante." Victor knew I'd been in the room. He knew I'd been asking questions. The only way he could know that is if someone in this house is reporting to him. Victor is family. Victor is the second architect of Project Blackwell. The words landed. She watched them land. She'd had 40 seconds to decide how to deliver this information, and she'd decided on direct because there was no version of gentle that served either of them right now. Dante's breathing changed, just slightly. A controlled deepening, the kind of adjustment a person makes when they need their body to hold steady while their mind takes an impact. "That's a significant claim," he said. "I know it is." "Based on what?" She told him about Mara's discovery, sealed filing, Marco's motion for protective custody, her own name in a redacted document 12 years old. She told him about the memory she'd excavated, the quiet man who'd picked her up from school, who she'd thought was a family friend. She told him what she'd concluded, that Marco had known what her father was involved in, had chosen to protect her rather than use her as a pressure point, and had been killed before he could get her to safety. She told him that the unnamed second architect in the Project Blackwell files, the one Dante had never been able to identify, fit Victor's profile in every particular. The seniority, the access, the ability to move resources inside the organization without triggering scrutiny, the motive, which was control, not ideology, not revenge. Just the simple, brutal appetite for control that Dante's consolidating leadership had been slowly removing from his reach. Dante stood in the center of the room and listened without interrupting. His face, by the end, was something she had no prior category for. It wasn't grief, though grief was inside it. It wasn't rage, though that was there too. It was the expression of a man looking at a structure he'd spent a decade building, and understanding that the rot had been inside the foundation from the start. "He was at the funeral," Dante said. His voice was very quiet. He gave the eulogy. He stood at the grave. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. He sat across from me for 3 years while I dismantled the rivals, while I took apart every external threat. He stopped. His hands, she noticed, had closed into fists. Not at his sides, he'd crossed his arms. Containment rather than aggression. Every piece of intelligence I developed, every file I compiled, he had access to, she said. "Yes, which means he knew how close you were getting. When you got the drive with the Blackwell files, when you started decoding them, he knew. He would have known within days. So he accelerated." She moved away from the door, came toward him, not close, but within the same gravitational pull. "He arranged the marriage, not you him. Or he manipulated you into arranging it in a way that served his purposes." Dante looked at her sharply. "Think about how the debt came to you," she said. "The original creditor who made the introduction, who suggested you acquire it." A silence. "Victor," Dante said. The word came out like something scraped. "He handed you a reason to bring me inside," she said. "Controlled environment. He probably expected you to interrogate me, frighten me, use me to get to my father's knowledge of the files, and in the process, expose how much you actually knew, so he could act before you finished building the case. Instead, you didn't break," Dante said slowly. "You negotiated. You signed. You started asking your own questions. And he had to adapt." She stopped in front of him. The gala wasn't Kane's operation. It was Victor's, using Kane's people as cutouts. To kill you before you found what you found tonight. Yes. He looked at her. His eyes were doing something complicated and controlled, the way deep water looks when something large is moving underneath it. She held his gaze because she understood that this moment required her to hold it, that looking away now would cost them both something they couldn't afford. He'll know, Dante said, that the warning didn't work. He saw your face at the door. Yes. How long do we have before he moves? She thought about Victor's expression, the pleasantness of it, the absolute practiced warmth. She thought about what it took to maintain that performance for 11 years, hunting across a dinner table from a man who was hunting the killer of his brother and never once showing the seams. Hours, she said. Dante moved fast. She'd seen him operate in social situations, composed, measured, the deliberate pace of a man who understood that urgency telegraphed weakness. This was different. He was across the room and on his phone before she'd finished the word, and the calls he made were short and hard. And she caught enough of them to understand that within 20 minutes there were 4 people in this house who were being quietly and efficiently separated from their access to security systems and communication channels. Car materialized in the study doorway. 12 minutes later, he looked at Dante. Dante looked back. Some communication passed between them that required no words. Victor's driver logged a departure, Carr said. 8 minutes ago. He's in transit. To where? Unknown. His phone is off. Dante's jaw tightened. The warehouse on Pulaski. Carr's expression shifted slightly, the micro-adjustment of someone receiving information that recontextualizes something they already knew. You've had eyes on it? For 6 weeks. I knew someone was using it. I didn't know who. He moved toward the door. Now I do. Dante. Alara's voice stopped him. He turned. My father, she said. If Victor is moving, Kane is moving. And Kane knows where my father lives. Beat. Something crossed his face, not softness, but the recognition of what she was telling him and what it would cost him to act on it. Carr, he said, without looking away from her. Send 2 people to the Wicker Park address. No engagement, just extraction. Extraction to where? Here. He held Alara's gaze when he said it. Bring him here. She nodded. One short nod. It was the only thanks she offered, and he didn't seem to want more. They took 2 cars. Dante insisted she come. She'd expected an argument and had one prepared, but he didn't make her use it. He said, you know things about Victor and this file that I may need in the field. You stay in the car, unless I tell you otherwise. She agreed to that, because it was reasonable and because agreement was faster than negotiation. The city moved past the windows in the dark. She sat in the back seat with Dante and watched the south side slide by the warehouses, the particular texture of a neighborhood at 11 at night when most of what's moving isn't moving for innocent reasons. She felt cold and completely alert, every sense running at capacity, the way she'd felt in the dark room with the photographs, and again in the garden when Mara told her her own name. When we get there, Dante said, quietly so only she could hear, whatever you see, stay analytical. Don't react. I'm always analytical. Not about your father, you're not. She didn't argue. He was right. If he's there, she said, what does Victor want from him? Confession. Documented. Something he can use to redirect the federal interest toward your father if Dante's case gets close to completion. He paused. Victor's been positioning your father as the primary architect of Blackwell for years, building a paper trail that ends with him. My father as the scapegoat. Your father as the only guilty party. Clean hands for Victor. Everything else burned away. She thought about her father on the couch, with his hands over his face. He was guilty. She wasn't pretending he wasn't. But he was guilty the way a small gear is guilty when a larger mechanism destroys something. He'd made his choices, and those choices were real. But the man who'd wound the clock was Victor Moretti, and that man had been sitting at family dinners and giving eulogies and watching Dante chase shadows for 11 years. Car stopped. She looked out the window. The warehouse was a long, low brick structure set back from the street. Loading dock on the east side, corrugated doors, 2 ground floor windows visible from this angle, both dark. A single light showed above the dock, not bright, the kind of light that says occupied but doesn't want to be seen. Dante's security moved first. 4 men, 2 directions, covering the dock and the side entrance simultaneously. Dante waited 30 seconds, watching. Then he opened the car door. "Stay here," he said to her. She stayed. For about 90 seconds. Then she heard her father's voice, not the words. Just the register, high and cracked with something that was not an argument, but its opposite. The sound of a man making sounds because he had run out of language, and she got out of the car. The inside of the warehouse smelled of old machine oil and concrete dust. The main floor was cleared, empty, shadows pooling between the structural pillars. The light source was at the far end, a work lamp on a metal table, throwing harsh yellow light over a scene that locked her feet to the floor for a single second, before she forced herself to move again. Her father was in a chair. He was upright, not restrained that she could see, but the two men flanking him were sufficient restraint without needing rope. His face was bad, not beaten, but collapsed. The face of a man who had been in this room long enough to understand exactly how few options he had. Victor stood at the table with his back to her. He was looking at a tablet in his hand, and a camera on a small tripod was set up facing her father. Red light, steady. Recording. He was recording. Dante was 6 feet to her left, and she hadn't heard him stop because she'd come in from a different angle, and for a moment the three of them, her, Dante, Victor, formed a triangle with her father at its center, and nobody moved. Victor turned around. He looked at Dante first. His face did something extraordinary. It rearranged itself through something like sorrow, something like regret, the performance of a man who'd hoped it wouldn't come to this. Convincing. She'd have been convinced 3 days ago. "Dante," he said. His voice was warm. "Let me explain." "Stop." Dante's voice was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It had the quality of something that had been stripped of every unnecessary element. "Whatever you're about to say." "Don't." Victor looked at her then. The warmth remained, but something beneath it shifted. A tectonic adjustment she could feel more than see. "Mrs. Moretti, I'm glad you're here. Actually, there are things about your father you deserve to know." "I know what I need to know," she said. "Do you?" He set the tablet down on the table. Deliberate. Unhurried. "Your husband came here thinking he'd find the architect of his brother's death. He has. But the picture isn't quite what he's been building." He looked at Dante. "The files your wife found, they're real. Project Blackwell is real. But you've been reading them with the wrong frame, Dante. The money moved through Voss Manufacturing. Yes. But who do you think introduced it to the original creditors? Who do you think structured the arrangement? Beat. Her father didn't come to us," Victor said. "We went to him. We used him. The same way you used his daughter. He let that sit. The difference is, I know what I am." Dante said nothing. The muscle in his jaw was working. "I know what you have," Victor continued. He was very calm, the calm of someone who had prepared for this room. "I know how far the federal interest has progressed. I know, specifically, that you made contact with an assistant U.S. attorney 6 weeks ago. I know what you offered." He picked up the tablet again. "I have that conversation recorded." The air in the room changed. Alara watched Dante's face. For the first time since she'd known him, something cracked in the surface. Just briefly a line, hairline thin, there and then controlled back into stillness. She'd seen it. "You've been building a case to hand to federal investigators," Victor said. "Admirable. But you did it from inside the organization, which means everything you've documented is fruit of a poisoned tree. Your own hands are not clean, Dante. They've never been clean." He spread his arms slightly, the gesture of a man being reasonable. "Hand me what you have. The drives, the files, the attorney contact. Walk away. The business continues. Your wife's family is protected. Richard," he glanced at her father, "gets to go home." Her father's eyes found hers across the room. They were asking something she didn't have an answer for yet, and Marco, Dante said. Victor's expression didn't change. Marco made a choice. He filed for protective custody of a child. Dante's voice was still quiet, still stripped down. He was trying to get her out before you used her. Marco was going to destroy this family. He was going to save it. He was 20 years too young to understand what this family was. Victor's composure didn't crack, but something in his posture hardened a settling, a finalization. I built this organization for 30 years. Your father trusted me with it. I kept it alive through things you have no concept of. Marco was going to hand everything we built to federal prosecutors because he stopped. Principles. The way someone says the name of a disease. Alara moved. She didn't make a decision to move. Her body made it a single step to the left, toward the table, toward the camera on its tripod, with the red light still recording. Victor saw it the same instant, and his hand came up. Dante was already between them. Not between her and Victor, between Victor and the door, cutting off the geometry of the room. The two men who'd been flanking her father shifted, and then stopped, because Dante's security had materialized from 3 directions, and the mathematics of the room had changed entirely in about 4 seconds. Victor looked at the men around him. He looked at Dante. Something moved in his expression, the first genuinely uncontrolled thing she'd seen from him. A flicker of something that might have been fear if it had lasted longer. Didn't last long. You won't hand me to federal investigators, Victor said. Too much of what I know implicates you. Maybe, Dante said. There's no maybe. I know every decision you've made for 11 years. Every asset, every operation, every conversation with that attorney. You take me down, you go with me. That's possible, Dante said. He was very still. I've been thinking about that. Victor studied him. And I decided I don't care. Silence. I've been running this organization since I was 31 years old, Dante said. I've been running it because I thought it was what I owed my family. What I owed Marco. He took one step forward. Marco didn't want this. He was trying to get out of it. He was trying to protect a child from it. He filed paperwork and made legitimate contact with the state attorney's office because he believed in the structure of the law. Another step, and you killed him for it. I made a decision. You killed my brother. Quietness broke. Finally, and what was underneath it was not a shout. It was worse than a shout. It was something compressed and enormous that had been held in a closed space for 11 years and was now simply being stated as fact. You stood at his grave and gave a eulogy, and you killed him. You sat at my table for 11 years and watched me hunt his killers, and you killed him. Victor said nothing. For the first time, he had nothing. Ilara looked at the camera. The red light was still on. She crossed to the table in 4 steps. Victor's head snapped toward her, and she saw in his face the belated understanding of what she was doing, not stopping the recording. Using it, she picked up the tablet. She looked at the recording that had been running since before they arrived. Victor's voice, clear and unambiguous, speaking in a lit room to her father about Project Blackwell, about Dante's federal contact, about the architecture of a conspiracy spanning more than a decade. How long has this been recording? She said to her father. His voice was rough. He started it when we came in, an hour ago. He was recording my father's confession, she said to Dante, without lowering the tablet. The camera was recording the room. Victor moved, not toward her, toward the exit, a sudden sharp motion that had nothing of the measured diplomat left in it. Pure animal calculation. He'd made it 2 steps before Tuante'Adani's men closed the angle, and it stopped. He stood between them, breathing hard, and for the first time the performance was completely gone. What was left was a 60-year-old man who had run out of moves, and the absence of the performance made him look, suddenly, much older, smaller, the size of what he'd actually done, stripped of the framing he'd always supplied for it. Alara was still holding the tablet. She looked at the recording. She looked at Dante. The federal attorney, she said. The one you contacted 6 weeks ago. Is the contact still open? He looked at her. Yes. Then we don't need to decide what to do with this tonight, she said. We need to get this recording secured and get it to someone who can act on it legally. Because the moment we handle this any other way, Victor wins not now, but eventually. Case collapses. The evidence is tainted. He walks. She held the tablet out toward him. You hand this to the attorney, and you let the law be the thing that takes him down. The way Marco wanted to do it was very quiet. Dante looked at the tablet. He looked at Victor. He looked at Elara. Victor said, "You don't know what you're doing." "I know exactly what I'm doing," she said. "I'm finishing what Marco started." She held the tablet steady and waited for Dante to take it. And outside the warehouse, the city went on in the dark, indifferent, enormous, and entirely unaware that inside this building, 11 years of accumulated damage had just reached a moment where it would either consume everyone involved or, finally, cost of everything it had taken to get here, be made to answer for itself. Dante reached out. His hand closed around the tablet. His eyes stayed on hers for a moment that had weight and duration beyond its actual length. Then his phone rang. He looked at the screen. His expression shifted. "Car," he said. He took the call, listened for 4 seconds. When he lowered the phone, his face had changed in a way that told he said a word, that the room they were standing in was no longer the most dangerous place they needed to be. "My father," she said. Not a question. "Kane's people got to Wicker Park before ours did," he said. She was moving before Dante finished the sentence. Not running was panic, and panic was the enemy of the next 60 seconds, but fast. Crossing the warehouse floor toward the exit, with her coat still open, and her mind already ahead of her body, doing the calculation. Wicker Park was 12 minutes from here without traffic. At this hour, 10. Car's people had been 4 minutes behind Kane's. That meant her father had been in Kane's hands for 6 minutes minimum, possibly 8. "How many?" she said to Dante, who was 2 steps behind her. "Unknown. Carr said 2 vehicles. Is my father alive when they took him? That's all Carr has." She got to the car. The driver already had the engine running. She got in and Dante got in beside her, and the car was moving before the door was fully closed. She looked back through the rear window. The warehouse entrance. Victor standing between 2 of Dante's men, silver-haired and diminished, and something about the image, the formal bearing, finally stripped of its context. Distinguished posture now, just an old man being held in a loading dock, lodged in her chest like a splinter. Turned back around. "Carr has a location," she said. "He's tracking the vehicles." Dante's phone was in his hand. "They're not going far. Kane doesn't move people far inside the city when he's improvising. He finds ground he knows. What ground does he know on the south side?" Dante's jaw worked. He pressed the phone to his ear. "Carr, where are they?" A pause. "Send it." He lowered the phone and looked at her. "Property on Halstead. Industrial building, half renovated. Kane's used it before. How long?" 7 minutes. Pressed her hands flat against her thighs and held them there. The city moved past the windows. She thought about her father in that apartment, with his hands over his face. She thought about what she'd said to him, you knew, and the way he hadn't denied it, the way denial had simply been beyond him by then. She thought about the fact that she'd meant every word she said, and also that she was now in a car moving as fast as the driver dared through the south side of Chicago, because those same words were not the last ones she wanted him to hear. People were complicated. She'd always known that in the abstract. Tonight had turned it into something she'd carry in her body. "When we get there," she said. Her voice was steady. She was making it steady through effort, and she didn't think Dante was fooled, but she also didn't think he'd say so, because he understood by now what she needed. "Kane wants leverage. He took my father because Victor's operation is blown, and he needs a way to renegotiate." "Yes. Which means my father is worth more to him alive and usable than any alternative. For now, so we have a window. A short one. Then we use it." She looked at him. "Tablet. You have it secured?" He patted his jacket. "Inside side pocket." "If we get my father out," she said, "and if Victor is handed to federal investigators tonight, Kane loses both his leverage and his operational cover simultaneously. He's exposed. Kane doesn't go quietly, I know. She paused. But he goes. If the federal case is solid, he goes. She held Dante's gaze. Solid? He was quiet for a moment. The car moved. Streetlights strobed across his face. Light, dark, light. 6 weeks ago, I would have said almost. Tonight, he touched the inside of his jacket again. Tonight, it's solid. The building on Halstead was exactly what Dante had described, half renovated, which meant the exterior looked like construction, and the interior smelled like sawdust and old concrete, and the wiring was exposed in long runs along the ceiling. Car was there when they arrived, 2 vehicles back from the entrance, and he briefed in 30 seconds. 2 men on the ground floor, position unknown for Kane himself. Her father was in the upper interior space, accessible by a single staircase from the east end. 1 staircase, Dante said. 1 confirmed. There may be a second through the construction access as on the north side. Maybe. Yes. He looked at Alara. She looked back. Neither of them said the obvious thing, which was that 1 confirmed staircase and an unknown interior made extraction complicated, and that complicated extraction with her father as the central variable, and Kane as the decision-maker, was not a situation with clean outcomes. I'm going in, she said. Alara, not armed, not as a threat. She held up a hand before he could continue. Kane is improvising. Victor's network is collapsing as we stand here. He took my father because he needed a bargaining chip fast, which means he doesn't have a plan. Yet he has a person and a location, and he's deciding what to do. She looked at Carr, then back at Dante. If I walk in ahead of you, alone I change the geometry. I'm not a threat. I'm a negotiation. I give him something to talk to, and while he's talking to me, you come through the north access. We don't know if the north access exists, Carr said. Then find out. You have. She looked at her watch. 4 minutes before I go in. Dante stepped close to her. Not to block her, she could tell the difference. He stepped close. It's the way someone steps close when they're trying to make sure they're seen clearly, when the words matter and the distance would dilute them. If something goes wrong in there, he said low. I know. I need you to know that He stopped. His jaw worked. He was not. She had learned over the past weeks. A man who said the unfinished things. He finished things, or he didn't say them. Watching him stop in the middle of a sentence was its own kind of data. I know, she said again, quietly. I know. She turned and walked toward the building entrance. She found Kane on the upper floor, which was exactly where Carr had said open space. Exposed beams, the ambient city light coming through gaps in the construction, sheeting over the windows. Her father was sitting on an overturned crate. He was intact. He looked up when she came through the staircase entrance, and something moved across his face that she didn't have a name for yet. Kane was standing 10 feet from him. He turned when she appeared. She'd seen photographs. The reality was somewhat different. He was older than his images, mid-50s, with the particular leanness of a man who'd spent decades being cautious about what he let into his body and his confidence. He was good-looking in a functional way, not threatening in his bearing, which she suspected was deliberate. Men who looked threatening announced themselves. Kane had learned a long time ago that the men who actually made decisions about who lived and who didn't usually look like accountants. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the staircase behind her. Just you, he said, just me. He considered that. I don't believe you. That's your right. She came further into the room. Not fast, not slow, the pace of someone who had decided where they were going and wasn't advertising urgency. But the people with me are far enough back that this conversation has time to run its course. Which is what I'm offering. A conversation. You've got nothing I want from a conversation. You took my father because you needed something to negotiate with. Victor's done. That's not speculation. That's accomplished fact. He's in custody as of 40 minutes ago. She watched Kane's face for the register of that. She saw a small tightening around the eyes. Your operational cover is gone. Kane, whatever arrangement you had with Victor, whatever you were getting from this, it's over. Then why are you here instead of calling the police? Because calling the police takes time, and in that time things can go wrong. My father is in this room. She looked at her father briefly. He was watching her, with an expression she'd only seen on him once before. The night she was 12 and had been in a car accident. And he'd had arrived at the hospital and found her standing in the hallway with a bandaged arm. And the look on his face had been the particular compound of relief and devastation that belongs to parents who have almost lost something they didn't adequately value while they had it. He wore it now, and she looked away from it because she couldn't afford it yet. I want him out of this room. That's the negotiation. Kane studied her. What are you offering? The recording on the tablet in Dante Moretti's jacket documents Victor's full account of Project Blackwell. Your name appears twice in the Blackwell files. I've read them. Both references are operational, not directorial. You were contracted, not a principal. She watched his face. Federal investigators are going to get those files. Victor is going to be the central figure. Whether you are a secondary figure or a cooperative witness is still a variable. The room was very quiet. She could hear traffic outside. She could hear her father breathing on the crate behind Kane. You're not a federal attorney, Kane said. No. But Dante has been in contact with one for 6 weeks, and what happens in the next 20 minutes shapes the story that attorney receives. She kept her eyes on him. You've been in this business long enough to know that the story is what matters. Victor's story ends in prison. Yours doesn't have to. Kane looked at her for a long time. She held it. She let him look, let him calculate, let him run the variables she'd laid out and add the ones she didn't know about. The private accounting of a man who'd spent 30 years surviving by reading situations accurately. Then she heard it from the north side of the building. Barely audible, the sound of weight on a floor she couldn't see. Kane heard it too. His hand moved. Her father came off the crate. She didn't understand what was happening. For about a half second, during which the geometry of the room shifted, and her father, who was 62 years old and had been sitting on a crate for the better part of an hour, was somehow between her and Kane, his hands up, his voice saying, weight in a register she'd never heard from him, raw and absolute. Kane's hand stopped. Don't, her father said. His voice was shaking badly, but he didn't move back. He stood between them, and his hands were up, and he was looking at Kane with an expression that had nothing strategic in it, nothing calculated, just a man who had run out of time to be anything other than what he was. She's not part of this. She's standing in this room, Kane said. 'Cause of me. His voice broke slightly on the last word, and he didn't try to control it. Every part of this started because of me. She's here because I put her here, the same way I put Marco Moretti in the ground, the same way I put my own family inside something I didn't have the spine to walk away from. He was breathing hard, so don't. Whatever you're going to do next, you do it to me, not to her. The room held the moment. Dante came through the north access. She heard him, heard his people, heard the shift in the room as Kane processed that he was now in an untenable position from 4 directions. Kane was smart enough to do the math without having to see all of it. He lowered his hand. He sat down on a beam. He put his hands on his knees. Get your father out of here, he said to Alara. Later, much later, she would think about what it had cost her father to stand up from that crate. She would think about it the way you think about things that you can't fit into a simple category, not heroism, not redemption, Sian. Those words were too clean for what it actually was. It was just a 62-year-old man deciding, in the last available moment, that one true thing was better than none. That one true thing done late was still better than nothing true done at all. She did not thank him that night. She wasn't ready to. She wasn't sure she would ever be ready to in the way that the word thank implied, because what he'd done in that room didn't erase what he'd done in the years before it, and she was not the kind of person who confused one for the other. But she held his arm on the way down the stairs, and she didn't let go until they were outside. Victor was handed to federal investigators on a Thursday morning. Dante's attorney, the one he'd been building the relationship with for 6 weeks, a careful, methodical woman named Reyes, who worked out of the Northern District office and had a reputation for cases that held under appeals, received the tablet recording, the decrypted Blackwell files, and 3 supporting until it changed that traced the money, financial documents that traced the money from Voss Manufacturing through 4 intermediate accounts to the operational fund that had paid for the contracted element of Project Blackwell. Courting was the keystone. Victor, in his own voice, in a lit room, speaking at length about decisions he'd made, resources he'd moved, and a federal contact he'd been monitoring. Reyes called Dante 2 days later and used the word comprehensive in a tone that in a more demonstrative person would have been excitement. Kane entered into cooperation discussions within 72 hours. His name appeared in the final indictment as a cooperating witness. He would do time. Reyes was clear about that. There was no path that didn't involve time, but the architecture of the case would belong to Victor, and it was Victor's name that the city would eventually read in the press. Alara's father was another matter, and she was honest with herself about the fact that it was the hardest matter to resolve, harder than anything involving Victor or Kane, because those were people she could keep at the proper distance. Her father she could not. He came to her 3 weeks after the night on Halstead, came to the door of the mansion she was still living in. She hadn't yet made a decision about that, and she'd allowed herself the grace of not making it while other things were still moving. She let him in. They sat in the East Wing sitting room, not the study, and she made tea she didn't offer to him because the gesture felt false, and she sat across from him and waited. He told her things she already knew. She let him tell them anyway, because the telling was part of it, the having to say it out loud, in sequence to a person who knew which parts were true and which parts were the softened versions he'd been telling himself. She didn't interrupt. She didn't help. She didn't help. She sat and listened, and when he was finished, she looked at him for a long time without speaking. "I've spoken with Reyes," she said finally. "Your cooperation in the Blackwell documentation, the records you kept, the ones you turned over, carries weight." She said you were thorough. "I kept everything," he said. His voice was subdued. "I don't know why. I told myself it was insurance, but I think I kept it because I wanted there to be a record. Something that said this happened." He looked at his hands. "Something that couldn't be unmade." She nodded. "There'll be civil exposure. The financial liability from the Blackwell funds can be traced back through Voss Manufacturing. The business will have to be restructured." "I know. And the criminal exposure." "I know that too." He looked up at her. "I'm not asking for anything, Alara. I'm not here asking you to fix it. Then why are you here?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the window, at the garden beyond it, at the cold fall light on the stone wall. When he looked back, his eyes were clear in a way they hadn't been for a long time. "Because you deserve to have a father who stood up. The first time," he said. "Not the last time. The first time, when it would have actually changed something." His voice didn't break, but it was close. "Can't give you that. I'm here. Because I want you to know I know the difference." She looked at him. She looked at him. She didn't forgive him. Not that morning. In that room, forgiveness was not something she could manufacture on a timeline, and she wouldn't insult either of them by pretending otherwise. But she understood him, which was not the same thing, and was also not nothing. She understood how a man convinces himself that a small compromise is contained, how one decision made from fear becomes the architecture of everything that follows, how a person can spend a decade looking away from something they set in motion because looking at it directly would require them to become someone they don't know how to be. She understood it. She also knew she would never repeat it. "Go home, Dad," she said. "Let Reyes do her work. Take care of Mom." He nodded. He stood up. He was halfway to the door when he stopped and turned. "The man who picked you up from school," he said. "Marco." She waited. "He genuinely cared about you," he said. "That wasn't strategy." He was that kind of person. A pause. I know what I cost you when I cost him. She held his gaze for a moment. I know, she said. He left. The legitimate portion of her family's business was restored over the following 4 months, restructured under new financial controls and a compliance framework that Reyes's office had a hand in shaping. The money recovered from Victor's concealed accounts. A fig that surprised and the Victor cleansing the full attorneys, when forensic accounting was complete, was applied first to the outstanding Moretti debt, which was officially cleared, and then to the civil obligations that had accumulated during the Blackwell investigation. Voss Manufacturing became smaller and cleaner and genuinely solvent for the first time in years. Her mother's treatment continued. The better treatment, the one that cost more, the one that was working. Alara kept her job. She went back to it the week after the Halstead night and sat at her desk and approved a supply contract and attended a budget meeting and ate a sandwich at her desk. And it tasted like something, which she counted as progress. She and Dante had a conversation on a Sunday in November that neither of them had planned. Come into the main room, looking for a book she'd left there, and he'd been at the table, with coffee and the newspaper, and they'd been in the same room together, without the urgency of anything specific, which was new. She sat down across from him, not at the far end, at the same end, with the chair pulled around slightly so they were at an angle rather than fully opposed. He lowered the paper. The 12 months, she said. Yes, it's been 9, I know. She looked at her hands on the table, then at him. I haven't decided what I want the end of it to look like. Neither have I, he said. That's honest. I'm working on being honest. He said it without irony, which made it something other than a line. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about the first night, the contract on the marble table, the chandelier, the pen in her hand. She thought about the locked room and the photographs and the cold glass at the window. She thought about a car moving through its stark city with her hand pressing a bandage against his arm. She thought about Victor's pleasant face, delivering a warning in a hallway, and her father standing up from a crate with his hands raised, and Dante in the warehouse saying, I've been thinking about that with the equanimity of a man who had made a genuine peace with consequence. She thought about Marco Moretti, who she did not remember, but who had driven her to school and made her laugh and filed paperwork in a courthouse, trying to keep her safe. The organization, she said, being restructured. He set the paper aside. The federal agreement has parameters. Certain operations cease. Others are divested. It takes time. And at the end of it, he looked at her steadily. I'm not sure. What's left of it is something I want to keep. She held that for a moment. That's a significant thing to say. It's a significant situation. What would you do instead? He thought about it. Really thought. Would she recognize the specific quality of his silence when he was being honest rather than strategic? Something that doesn't require me to know which rooms are being used. For what in my own house, he said finally. She almost smiled. It surfaced briefly and then settled back, but he saw it. The contract, she said. The original, I have it. I don't want it renegotiated. She looked at him clearly. I don't want another set of terms. I don't want a new agreement with different conditions. It was very still. I want to decide things for reasons that have nothing to do with what was signed in that room, she said. That's all I know right now. The rest I don't know yet. He looked at her for a long time. Then he stood up. He went to the desk in the corner she'd seen him use it, knew he kept things in the lower drawer. He opened it and produced the original contract, 12 pages clipped together. He set it on the table between them. He picked up the lighter from the desk. She watched him burn it. He held it over the ceramic saucer, the same instinct she'd had, the same object. And she didn't remark on that, and the pages caught and burned and went to ash in a little under 2 minutes. He set the saucer aside. He sat back down. No debt, he said. No debt. No obligation. No. He looked at her. Something in his face that was new or not new. She'd seen pieces of it in the car, in the garden, in the warehouse. But here in the morning light, Without urgency and without crisis, it had room to be what it actually was. Not softness. He wasn't built for softness. Something more durable than softness. I don't know how to do this the regular way, he said. I want to be honest about that. I don't think there is a regular way after this particular year, she said. No. The corner of his mouth moved. Probably not. 4 months later, on a morning in early March, when the city was thinking about becoming something warmer, and the light was different than it had been since September, Elara stood outside the front entrance of the restored Voss manufacturing offices. The sign above the door was new. The company inside was smaller but real. Her mother had accompanied her this morning. She was moving better, the treatment holding, and had stood in the lobby and looked around at the clean space and said nothing. For a moment, and then said, quietly, your grandfather would have liked it this way. Dante was there. She hadn't asked him to come, and she hadn't told him not to. He stood to her right and slightly back, the way a person stands when they're present but not claiming the occasion as theirs. She recognized it as a considered choice. The city moved around them. It did what cities do, it moved, without reference to any of them. Enormous and ongoing, full of things that had nothing to do with Project Blackwell, or sealed court filings, or a charity gala with a broken window, or a man standing up from a crate with his hands raised. Full of people whose lives were their own complicated, unfinished business, none of it less real for being invisible. She stood outside the building her grandfather had built, and looked at the city, Dante's voice beside her. Quiet. Would you have chosen this year if you'd known what it was going to be? She thought about it. Genuinely. She owed the question that. No, she said. I'd have been terrified. But now? She looked at the street, at the light on the buildings, at her mother through the glass door of the lobby, talking to someone, her color better than it had been in 2 years. Now I know what I'm capable of, she said. That's not nothing. He was quiet beside her for a moment. When you're ready, he said, and stopped. She waited. When you're ready, he said again, and not a moment before I'd like to ask you something. When I'm sure I know how to ask it honestly. She looked at him. He looked back. No contract between them, no debt, no condition. Just two people standing on a sidewalk in early March, in a city that didn't care, having arrived at a place that had cost them nearly everything to reach. When you know how to ask it honestly, she said, I'll be listening. The morning light moved across the stone face of the building. Her mother laughed at something through the glass. The city went on, and the year that had started with a pen in her hand at 2:13 in the morning settled, finally, into the past, not erased, not forgotten, not made into anything simpler than what it had been. Just behind them now, where the hardest things go when you've survived them, still present, still real, and no longer in charge of what comes next. The restructuring of Dante's organization, completed in April. Federal agreement was honored in full. 3 operations ceased. 2 others were formally divested to legitimate holding companies under compliance oversight. What remained was smaller than what had existed before, leaner, less powerful in the ways that had always carried the most danger, and Dante signed the final documents on a Tuesday afternoon without ceremony, in Reyes's office, with Elara present, because he'd asked her to be, and she'd said yes because she meant it. Reyes shook both their hands. She was not a demonstrative woman. The handshake was enough. Outside on the sidewalk afterward, Dante stood for a moment looking at nothing in particular. The afternoon light was the kind that comes in April in Chicago, when the season has real warmth in it, not the false warmth of a good day in February that fools you into putting away your coat too soon. He turned up his face slightly. She watched him do it. Done, he said. Done, she agreed. He looked at her. He looked like a man who had put down something very heavy and was still adjusting to the absence of the weight, not free of it yet, still feeling the shape of what used to be there, but upright. Present lunch? He said. Yes, she said. Somewhere with bad lighting and good food. I know a place. You always know a place. They walked. She did not take his arm, and he did not offer it, because they were still learning the grammar of ordinary things, and ordinary things required more care than emergencies. Emergencies had their own language. This was harder. This was two people deciding, in the small, unremarkable space of a Tuesday afternoon, to keep choosing each other. Her father entered a formal cooperation agreement with the Northern District in May. The criminal exposure was real, and the resolution was not clean. It was never going to be clean, but it was honest. And honest was the thing she had decided she could live with. The thing she had decided was worth more than any particular outcome. He would face consequences. He had accepted that. She had watched him accept it, and had understood that acceptance, finally, as the thing he'd been incapable of for 12 years, simply being what he was, without the architecture of justification around it. She visited her parents on a Sunday in May. Her mother made food there was too much of, which was her mother's constant and unchanging response to any situation that required something from her. She cooked. She fed people. She expressed through abundance what she couldn't always say directly. Her father sat at the table and was quiet in the way he was quiet. Now not the old quiet, the one that had been concealment, but something more open. He asked about Alara's work. She told him. He listened in a way he hadn't when she was young, with his full attention instead of the partial attention of a man whose mind was always somewhere managing something dangerous. When she left, he walked her to the door. He didn't say much. He held the door and looked at her and said, "Thank you for coming." "I'll come next Sunday," she said. He nodded. That was all. It was enough. Victor Moretti was indicted on 11 counts in June. The indictment was 43 pages. His name appeared in the press that Thursday morning, and the city read it in the way. Cities, the things, with appetite first, then with the short attention of a world that had many other things to move toward. Dante read the article once, set the paper down, did not pick it up again. She watched him across the breakfast table. He looked up, caught her watching, and something passed between them, not a conversation, nothing that needed to be a conversation. Just the acknowledgement of a weight that had been carried for 11 years, finally setting down, somewhere outside size, both of them, in the hands of people and institutions designed to carry it the rest of the way. Marco would have found this satisfying, he said. Yes, she said. I think he would have. Dante looked down at his coffee. A moment. Then he would have liked you. She held that quietly. She did not deflect it, and she did not make it smaller than it was. She let it be what it was, a true thing, said plainly, by a man who was learning how to say true things plainly. She understood how much it cost him, and she understood that the cost was worth it, and she believed he was beginning to understand it, and that, too. I wish I remembered him better, she said. I know. He paused. I'll tell you about him, if you want. Not all at once. But when it fits, I'd like that, she said. On a Wednesday evening in late June, he asked her. They were in the garden. The light was going. She had a glass of wine she was barely drinking, and he had nothing. Just his hands, and the evening, and the sound of the city beyond the wall. They had been sitting in a comfortable quiet for 20 minutes when he said her name. She looked at him. He looked back at her, with the particular directness of a man who had decided that the cost of honesty was always lower than the cost of its absence, a thing he had not always believed and had paid dearly to learn. Elara, he said, would you stay? Not because of a contract, not because of what we owe each other. Would you stay because you want to? She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the man who had burned a document in a ceramic saucer and meant it, who had taken a bullet and called it grazed and then submitted to her hands, pressing against the wound, who had said, I've been thinking about that when fun. He confronted with the possibility of losing everything, and had meant that he genuinely thought it through and made his peace, thought about the year. She thought about who she had been on the night she signed her name in cold chandelier light, and who she was now, sitting in a garden in June with the city around her. She was not the same person. She was not simpler or less scarred. She was not repaired into some better version of the woman she'd been before. She was the same woman, complicated and flawed and clear-eyed, who had walked through something terrible and come out the other side still standing, still herself, still choosing. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Yes, she said. I'll stay. He nodded once. He did not make it more than it was, and she loved him. For that, the word arriving in her quietly, without drama, the way true things usually arrive when you've stopped trying to force them. The garden held the evening light. The city moved beyond the wall. And the story that had begun with a signature in the dark closed, finally, not with a clean ending, because nothing that real and nothing that hard ever ends cleanly, but with two people sitting in the growing dark, choosing the same direction and meaning it.